Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. He asked for help, but I realized too late what he really wanted. Not in the way most people might assume, but in a way that left me looking back on the moment, wondering how I had missed the signs. It wasn't about words unspoken or gestures ignored, it was about the quiet need in his voice, the weight behind the way he looked at me, and the trust he placed in my hands before I even knew what it meant. It all started on a grey afternoon in early spring. The kind of day where the air hangs heavy with dampness, the trees still bare from winter, and the faint smell of soil rises from the ground as if the earth itself is trying to wake up. I was carrying groceries from my car when I saw him across the street, Tom. He was my neighbor, though we hadn't known each other long. A retired history teacher, in his late 60s, who lived alone after his wife had passed a few years earlier. His house always looked well kept, though a little too quiet, like a place where time had slowed down. He waved at me that afternoon, a hesitant sort of wave, as though he wasn't sure if I would wave back. I did, of course, setting down my bags on the curb. That's when he called out, asking if I might have a moment. His voice cracked slightly, not from age but from something deeper. Without hesitation, I crossed the street. When I reached his porch, he gestured toward an old wooden chair leaning unsteadily against the railing. "I could use a hand with this," he said with a faint smile. The chair's leg was loose, and he explained he didn't trust himself with tools anymore, his hands shook too much. He said it casually, but I could see the frustration beneath his words. I agreed to help, and as I fetched my small toolbox from the garage, I felt oddly nervous, as if this simple task was something more. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me, not just with gratitude, but with a sort of longing for connection. Inside his house, the air smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. His living room was lined with shelves full of novels, history texts, and framed photographs. His late wife smiled down from one of the pictures, a warm woman with kind eyes. I paused at it longer than I meant to, feeling almost like an intruder. We set the chair on the rug, and I knelt beside it, tools in hand. Tom lowered himself onto the couch, watching me work. At first, he made small talk, the weather, the neighborhood, how the world seemed to be changing faster than he could keep up with. But slowly, the conversation shifted. He began to tell me about his teaching days, how he had loved working with students, seeing their eyes light up when they understood something. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, almost youthful. I could imagine him standing at the front of a classroom, chalk in hand, commanding the attention of a room full of restless teenagers. Yet in the pauses between his stories, I felt something else. A silence that carried weight. He looked at me as if he wanted to say more, but didn't know how. I tightened the last screw on the chair and tested it, smiling up at him proudly. "There," I said. "Good as new." He smiled back, but his eyes softened in a way that caught me off guard. "It wasn't about the chair at all. It never had been. Thank you," he said quietly. "Not just for this, but for being here. It's been a long time since anyone sat in this room with me." Something in my chest tightened. I realized then that what he had asked for wasn't really help with the chair, it was help with loneliness. Help with the kind of emptiness that no tool or quick fix could repair. We sat together for a long while after that, drinking tea he brewed carefully in mismatched cups. He told me about the garden his wife used to tend, about the trips they had taken before her illness, and about the silence that had filled the house after she was gone. He didn't cry, though I saw his hands tremble slightly as he held his cup. I listened, truly listened, and I think that was all he had wanted from me. Someone to share the weight of his memories, someone who wouldn't rush him or turn away. The tension in the room was subtle but strong, an invisible thread connecting us, a thread I hadn't realized was being woven until I was already caught in it. When I left that evening, the sky had darkened to a deep violet, and the streetlights glowed softly along the empty road. Tom stood at his doorway, watching me cross back to my house. I looked over my shoulder once more before stepping inside. He raised his hand in a small wave, the kind of wave that said more than words ever could. That night, I lay awake thinking about him. About the look in his eyes when he said thank you, the unspoken plea behind it. I realized too late what he truly wanted, not a fixed chair, but a moment of human closeness. A reminder that he wasn't forgotten in a world that had moved on without him. And in that realization, I felt something stir within me too. A sense of responsibility, perhaps, but also something gentler. A recognition that sometimes, the help we give is not in the form of what's asked, but in what is needed most. I drifted to sleep with the image of his quiet smile lingering in my mind, not knowing then how deeply that single afternoon would begin to change the rhythm of my own life. The days that followed felt strangely different. I went about my routine work, errands, cooking simple dinners, but there was a shift I couldn't quite put into words. It was as if Tom's presence lingered, not in a burdensome way, but in the quiet corners of my thoughts. Every time I passed his house, I wondered what he was doing, whether he was sitting in that too quiet living room or walking slowly through the garden he had mentioned. I didn't have to wonder for long. One late afternoon, as I returned from the store, I saw him again on his porch. This time, he wasn't waving me over, he was simply sitting there, staring out at the street. His posture was slumped, his hands folded together, and his eyes seemed far away. Something pulled at me. I couldn't just go inside and pretend I hadn't seen. So, I walked over. Mind some company? I asked. He looked up, startled at first, then smiled faintly. I'd be glad for it, he said. I sat down on the porch steps, setting my grocery bag beside me. The air smelled of damp wood and the faint sweetness of blooming lilacs nearby. We didn't speak for a while. There was a strange comfort in the silence, as if words weren't necessary just then. Eventually, he spoke, his voice low. You know, the hardest part isn't the quiet. It's forgetting the sound of her voice. After a while, you start to doubt if you remember it right. His confession caught me off guard. It was raw, unpolished, and I could feel the ache in it. I turned to him slowly. Do you have any recordings? Videos? He shook his head. We never thought much of those things. Photos, yes. But voices vanish if you don't hold on to them. I didn't know what to say, so I simply reached over and rested my hand lightly on his arm. His muscles tensed under my touch, then slowly relaxed, as if the simple gesture had steadied him. He looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the loneliness break, replaced by something more, something like gratitude, something like hope. That evening, he invited me in again, though not with words. He just opened the door and gestured for me to follow. Inside, the house seemed warmer, less foreign than before. He showed me more photographs, albums tucked neatly into shelves. He narrated each one, his voice soft but growing more animated as he described the stories behind them. Trips to the coast, picnics in the park, the smile on his wife's face as she leaned against him in every picture. As he spoke, I noticed the way he kept glancing at me, as though measuring whether I truly wanted to hear. I did. Every detail mattered because it mattered to him. At one point, I asked, do you ever feel like telling these stories makes her closer, even just for a while? He paused, his eyes watering slightly, though no tears fell. Yes, he admitted. And maybe that's why I needed your help more than I realized. It's easier to carry memories when someone else is willing to hold a piece of them. The words sank into me, deeper than I expected. I had come over as a neighbor, but in that moment, I felt more like a witness to his life, a keeper of fragments that would otherwise be lost. We sat for hours, the daylight fading to twilight, and then to the soft glow of the lamp in his living room. The ticking clock on the wall filled the pauses between his stories, and somehow, it felt like time was slowing down just for us. When I finally stood to leave, he followed me to the door. He didn't say much, just, thank you again. But his voice carried something new, a weight and warmth that hadn't been there before. As I stepped outside, I felt a curious mix of emotions. Part of me was humbled by the trust he had placed in me, and another part of me felt a quiet fear of becoming too important, too quickly. But above all, there was a sense of connection. Not the kind that comes with excitement or infatuation, but the kind that grows quietly, almost invisibly, until it's undeniable. That night, I lay in bed replaying the way his eyes softened when I touched his arm, the way his voice steadied when he shared his memories. I realized something then. What Tom truly wanted wasn't just help, and it wasn't just company. He wanted someone who could see him not as the man left behind, not as the aging neighbor, but as a person still full of stories, still deserving of being heard. And as much as I tried to tell myself I was simply being kind, I knew the truth. Something inside me had shifted too. The third time I went to see Tom, it wasn't because he waved or asked, it was because I wanted to. Something about the evenings felt incomplete without hearing his voice, without seeing him sitting in that familiar chair or listening to him share another piece of his past. I told myself I was just being neighborly, just making sure he wasn't alone too much. But in my heart, I knew it had become something more. The day was unusually bright for early spring, the sunlight streaming across the quiet street. I carried a small basket with me, filled with fresh bread and jam I'd made. It felt almost silly, like a gesture from another era, but I wanted to bring him something of myself, not just my presence. When he opened the door and saw me standing there, his expression shifted from surprise to something softer, almost like relief. "You didn't have to," he murmured, taking the basket from my hands with care. "I wanted to," I replied simply. Inside, the house smelled faintly of brewed coffee, and a radio played softly in the background, an old jazz tune that seemed to belong perfectly in the space. We sat at his small kitchen table, the sunlight catching on the rim of our cups. He spread the jam onto the bread and handed me a piece as though it were some grand offering. "Between bites," he said quietly, "you remind me of her sometimes. Not in looks, but in the way you notice things. The way you really listen." The words made my breath catch. I wasn't sure how to respond. It felt like a confession, one he hadn't intended to make but couldn't hold back. I looked at him carefully, seeing the weight in his eyes, the ache of missing someone who could never return. "I'm not her," I said softly, almost apologetically. "I know," he answered quickly, shaking his head. "I don't want you to be. It's just, it feels like life is letting me breathe again when you're here." His honesty unsettled me, not because it was unwelcome, but because it stirred something inside me I hadn't expected. It wasn't romance in the traditional sense. It was deeper, quieter. A bond formed not out of desire but out of recognition, two people who had carried burdens in silence, now sharing them aloud. That afternoon stretched into hours. He showed me the garden out back, where the soil lay dark and waiting for spring planting. He told me his wife used to grow roses along the fence, and how he hadn't had the heart to replant anything since she passed. I bent down, pressed my fingers into the soil, and said gently, "Maybe it's time." He stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty garden bed, before nodding. "Maybe you're right." We made a plan to work on it together. Nothing formal, just an agreement spoken with a glance and a smile. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of gold and pink, I realized how natural it felt to be there. I wasn't counting the minutes or looking for an excuse to leave. Instead, I found myself wishing the day could stretch just a little longer. When I finally rose to go, Tom walked me to the door. He paused, his hand resting lightly on the frame as if he had something more to say. I turned to him, waiting. "You've given me more than you know," he said finally. I thought I was asking for help with a chair, but what I really asked for, what I didn't even know how to ask for, was someone to remind me that life isn't finished. That I'm still here. "And you've done that." The words struck me deeply, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to answer, but all I managed was a quiet, "I'm glad." As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I realized the truth of it. He had needed me, yes, but I had needed him too. The connection we shared wasn't accidental. It was something life had placed in front of us, fragile yet undeniable. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the empty garden, the way his voice softened when he spoke of his wife, the way his eyes looked when he admitted he felt alive again. And I wondered, what did I want this to become? Was I ready to carry a piece of his loneliness with him, knowing it might become part of my own? The answer wasn't clear yet. But what I did know was this: I couldn't turn away. Not anymore. The garden was where everything finally came together. Weeks had passed since that first afternoon with the broken chair, and what began as small visits had turned into a rhythm of sorts. I would stop by after errands, or he would call me over when he brewed too much coffee for himself. It was simple, almost ordinary, yet the ordinary had grown extraordinary in the way it filled something neither of us had realized was empty. That morning, I carried a tray of small flower seedlings I had picked up from the nursery, bright marigolds, lavender, and a few rosebush starters. Tom was waiting outside, leaning on the porch rail, his expression lifting when he saw me. "You didn't have to," he said, echoing words he'd used before. "I wanted to," I answered, smiling as I set the tray down. "Besides, you can't have a garden without flowers." Together, we knelt in the soil. His hands trembled a little, but he was steady in spirit, guiding me where to place each plant. The dirt clung to our fingers, the sun warmed our backs, and there was laughter, quiet, gentle laughter that felt rare and precious. At one point, he paused, wiping his brow, and looked at me. You know, I never thought I'd see this again. The garden alive, someone beside me. His voice softened. It feels like life is giving me a second spring. I didn't answer right away. I pressed a small rose cutting into the earth and covered it with soil, patting it gently before I finally said, and maybe it's giving me one too. We worked in silence after that, but it was not an empty silence. It was full, like the pause between notes of music, the kind that carries its own meaning. By late afternoon, the garden was dotted with color, young blooms standing like little promises of tomorrow. Tom and I stood side by side, looking at what we had made together. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled, a long, slow breath that sounded like release. I don't know what I expected that day when I asked for help, he said quietly. But it wasn't this. I didn't expect you. And now I can't imagine these days without you in them. The honesty of his words went straight to my heart. I felt tears prick my eyes, but I didn't turn away. Instead, I looked at him, really looked, and saw not just the man who missed his wife or the neighbor who lived in the quiet house across the street. I saw a man who was still living, still capable of giving and receiving connection, and somehow, he had chosen to share that with me. I reached for his hand. It was rough, warm, and unsteady, but it closed around mine with a strength that spoke louder than any words. We stood like that, two people bound not by romance in its usual sense, but by something both simpler and deeper, the recognition that neither of us had to walk alone anymore. As the sky turned to dusk and the first evening stars appeared, I knew something had changed. Not just for Tom, but for me too. I had thought I was helping him heal, giving him something he had lost. But in truth, he had given me something just as valuable, reminding me of the quiet power of presence, of listening, of being needed. Life doesn't always give us what we expect. Sometimes it gives us what we didn't know we were missing until it's right in front of us. That day, standing in the garden with Tom's hand in mine, I realized that what he wanted all along wasn't just help, it was connection. And in giving it to him, I found a piece of myself I hadn't realized was waiting to be found. I left that evening not with sadness, but with peace. And as I looked back at the garden from across the street, I knew the blooms we planted weren't just flowers. They were proof that life, even after loss, could grow again.